and welcome to the North American Invasive Species Management Association's January webinar. My name is Tegan Wilmot, and I serve as your Education and Prevention Manager at NASMA. Please say hello in the chat and share with us where you are watching from. And again, I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our first monthly webinar of the year, Rethinking Invasive Species Communication, Updates from National Workshops and Research. Before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about NASMA for those of you that don't know us well. NASMA, the North American Invasive Species Management Association, is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to empower invasive species management in North America. We are here to serve members in the professional and academic world who work on invasive species. We have a 16-member board, and we have 10 active committees that support our programming. We have 7 team members and a membership that continues to grow every day. We communicate with over 15,000 subscribers and interact with over 38,000 social media followers. And during National Invasive Species Awareness Week last year, we were able to extend that reach to over 3.4 million people, and we hope to continue to grow our reach again this year. What do we do? Well, NASMA provides the connection, the tools, and the voice you need to address invasive species. We frame our programs around these 4 pillars. We work hard to provide opportunities for collaboration and connection through our webinars, summits, annual conference, and discussion boards. We provide a collective voice on a national platform to advocate for relevance and support through our Government Relations Program and National Invasive Species Awareness Week. And we equip our membership with the tools needed to manage and educate the public about invasive species through Play Clean Go, the NASMA Shop, our Certified Weed-Free Products Program, Mapping Data Standards, and NASMA Academy. We are very excited to be hosting National Invasive Species Awareness Week from February 23rd through 27th. This year, we will be offering our virtual webinar series as well as an in-person experience in Washington, D.C. This is a great opportunity to be a part of a collective voice to advocate for support for invasive species legislation. This year's theme is Defending Our Health by Stopping the Spread. Please visit our website to learn more and register for these webinars. Also, please join us February 24th through the 26th in Annapolis, Maryland, as NASMA hosts the USDA Cooperative Forum on Invasive Species, previously known as USDA Interagency Research Forum on Invasive Species. This long-standing 30-year event is an in-person forum that brings together researchers, resource managers, and partners to share the latest science on invasive species. You can learn more and register for this event at nasma.org. As a friendly reminder, your membership dues help to fund our educational programs like this webinar. If you are not currently a member, we offer a variety of different membership options. You can view our membership structure on our website, and if you are unable to become a member right now, we encourage you to make a donation. Every gift, no matter the size, helps to support our programming. One of our newest member benefits is our NASMA discussion boards. When you become a member, you'll have access to these boards where you can ask your peers questions, share resources, discuss emerging challenges, and learn from peers across different sectors. Is someone else trying to manage the same species as you? Are there new innovative solutions that might help you solve a problem? This is a great place to start. We also have invasive species news, job opportunities, and trainings listed too. We're really excited about this new member benefit and hope you will join us on the discussion boards soon. If you want to sponsor NASMA in a bigger way, our Premier Partner Program is designed for you. Premier Partners enjoy benefits throughout the year, including acknowledgement on our website, at events, and more. And we would like to acknowledge and thank all of our 2026 Premier Partners whose generosity helps to make events like this webinar possible. And now we'll get started with our main event. Thank you for joining us today for Rethinking Invasive Species Communication, updates from national workshops and research. Before we begin, a quick note for our audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A box so we can make sure to address them after the presentations. Take a look first to see if your question has already been asked, and if so, give it a thumbs up to promote it to the top of the list. To get us started, I'd like to welcome Tim Campbell to provide us with an overview and to introduce our speakers today. Tim is the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Manager for the University of Wisconsin Sea Grant Program and the National AIS Liaison for the NOAA Sea Grant Program. He supports AIS prevention outreach, communications, and program evaluation, and works to apply university and sea grant resources to AIS issues. He has been with the Wisconsin Sea Grant since 2011. Tim, thank you for joining us today, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Tegan, and thank you everyone for attending. We have a bunch of people online. I'm really pleased that there's so much interest in this topic. And I think while very few of us are true communication professionals, I hope that through our discussion we can continue to kind of grow and learn in this space like I have, because I was not a communication specialist when I started with Wisconsin Sea Grant. I was good at sampling for fish and sometimes talking to people. And kind of over time, I've really realized that there was a need for more communication science around invasive species communication. I remember having a discussion with some colleagues where people had differing opinions of some messaging approaches for an event we were planning. And I was like, I'll dive into the data and figure out what works. And there wasn't a ton of data on what works. And so that has really kind of set me off on this this path of trying to learn more about our communications, the impacts of our communications, and how we can do better. And throughout this work, it's helped me make some great connections with colleagues, also kind of thinking about these issues. And it's been fun to work with everyone to learn more about this. And so some of the colleagues I've been working with are online, and they'll be sharing some work we've been doing to help learn more and push these issues forward. So first, we'll have a lower with Michigan Sea Grant, and they will be sharing some findings from a recent Sea Grant workshop that we co-hosted with NASMA in 2024 on invasive species and language use. And then later in the webinar, we'll have Kat and Christine sharing some results from a national survey on invasive species language use that is really focusing on one aspect of the language workshop and trying to better understand some of the impacts of our communications. So I will stop talking and hand it over to Elle Lower with Michigan Sea Grant. Elle works with the Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System, which are developing and updating species profiles and maps used to track the spread of non-native species throughout the Great Lakes region. Elle combines experience in stakeholder engagement and science communication to create and promote outreach material on AIS and their management efforts at the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab, or GLERL, in Ann Arbor. When not combing through literature reviews or teaching kids about lamprey, Elle can usually be found out in the woods with a stack of field guides or testing new recipes featuring wild and local ingredients. Thank you, Elle.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Tim. Well, welcome, and thank you for tuning in, everybody. As Tim said, my name is Elle Lower. I'm the Glances Communication Specialist at Michigan Sea Grant, and I'm here today to talk about the outcomes of a workshop I led along with, well, Tim of Wisconsin Sea Grant for National Invasive Species Awareness Week in February 2024, which seems like a lifetime ago, actually. It's called the Invasive Species Language Workshop, and I am pleased to report that not only was it really well attended and a pretty significant success, we've also identified a bunch of areas for future research that we wanted to share with you to lay the groundwork for and set the context for some of the other presentations in this session. So, why did we host this workshop in the first place? Here's some of the details about it. It was 2 years ago now, from February 27th through 28th for our National Invasive Species Awareness Week. We had a number of in-person participants, a bunch of virtual participants, although at this point, I think this webinar might even be outdoing that, as well as a peer-reviewed publication and multiple affiliated products that we'll touch on here. But why did we host this workshop in the first place? So for the last several years, I've been working on a number of talks and publications about how the language that we use when talking about invasive species has a powerful impact on how research gets done and how we engage the public. In addition to the technical terminology we use to refer to AIS, figurative language actually plays a pivotal role in shaping stakeholder perceptions and scientific understandings. So while the use of metaphor can simplify complex concepts to improve public understanding of invasive species and their impacts, using words carelessly introduces the risk of public misunderstandings and can actually really undercut the goals of doing science in a more inclusive way. Now, if you've been coming to meetings about AIS or Great Lakes issues for the last few years, there's a very high probability that you've heard me give a talk, either this one or some similar ones, on the importance of metaphor in science communication. So, in brief, I've been talking quite a bit about military and nativist metaphors in invasion biology, which can evoke powerful emotional responses, but also perpetuate narratives that do a lot more harm than good. So, while military language can have strong emotional appeal and sometimes garner political support for invasive species management, it really oversimplifies the nuanced relationship between humans and invasive species. Framing conflict with invasive species in terms of war can erase the reality that human behavior is largely responsible for this conflict in the first place. Similarly, nativist rhetoric, while attention grabbing, can fuel xenophobia and undermine good science communication. If you've ever worked with invasive carp, for example, there's a pretty good chance you've seen some of the really nasty comments comparing these fish with human immigrants on just about every article about them that gets posted to social media, which really undercuts our ability to do science in a coherent way without devolving into, say, internet slap fights. It gets ugly out there. Species naming conventions pose additional challenges, with some names perpetuating, say, racial biases or historical injustices, while place-based names can inadvertently stir controversy and division among lines of ethnicity or nationality, as seen with terms like Asian carp. Despite grassroots efforts and some successes in renaming species in recent years, a lack of standardized processes hinders broader adoption of more inclusive language. Inconsistent language and interpretations within invasion biology further complicate community engagement and management efforts. So, as I dove deeper into the literature and talked with other colleagues about these issues, it became really clear that although a handful of other scholars were also engaging with this topic, we were scattered across the country and, in fact, across the continent. Some of us are Canadian. And working mostly independently, and also that there was no national level guidance on linguistic best practices in invasive species communication. So we applied for a grant from the National Sea Grant Office and partnered with NASMA during National Invasive Species Awareness Week to bring folks together to collaborate and meet those information needs. So we had 11 presenters on day one, which was a hybrid webinar, and 15 in-person discussion participants on day two. And here's a little bit about what we talked about, and also a photo of us all hanging out together in Washington, D.C. So the hybrid presentations on day one focused on the use of language in the context of invasive species management. These presentations were divided and organized loosely into a couple of different themes here. First was efforts in renaming species. These presentations discussed ongoing projects aimed at renaming species with inappropriate names, as well as the process behind a number of renaming success stories. Specific examples included the process behind renaming the invasive moth Lymantria dispar, also now known as the spongy moth, how place-based names can sometimes be misleading in efforts to correct with that, as in the case of the European green crab, and the grassroots and agency-led efforts to change the common moniker of Asian carp. Another topic was standardizing terminology. Another set of presenters gave talks on the importance of operational definitions and standardized terminology in invasion biology, such as the difference between non-Indigenous and invasive. This really throws people off sometimes, and how this can lead to public misunderstandings or even messaging conflicts between agencies who are using different operational definitions. Another topic was emotional considerations and framing. Some presentations addressed the emotional aspects of invasive species management and the importance of framing messages positively and not giving in to doomerism, which I think is very important, especially in these trying times. We talked about social context and inclusivity. So several people discussed the importance of consulting with impacted human communities about names and language use change to ensure that it's a collaborative and just process that actually meets community needs rather than speaking for the people who are actually impacted. And then the last is interventions and collaborations. So we talked about efforts to address improving language around other STEM fields as well and what we could learn from them. Recommendations included interdisciplinary collaboration, training on language use, and advocacy for inclusive language standards. So overall, these presentations really highlighted the need for improved language use in invasive species management, with efforts focused on community engagement, standardizing terminology, and reframing messages to promote positive action. So the day two of the workshop, and here's me and Tim putting stuff up on our whiteboard. You'll see a lot more of that throughout this presentation. Was a small working session for 15 people that discussed lessons learned from the presentations of the previous day and worked through a process to share information, identify consistent issues, and set a path forward. Through a collaborative effort that involved a lot of this dry erase marker project and kind of looked like a detective's murder board by the time that we were done, we wound up identifying 4 specific areas for future research. And those are building evidence, co-production, networks for change, and operationalizing interventions. I'll go over these in a little more detail on the following slides. So the first is building evidence. So everybody who was at this meeting had multiple specific examples of language use in species naming issues that they had encountered in their work and were often bothered by, or had heard other people express discomfort over. However, these examples are not often captured in the academic literature, and we need more qualitative and quantitative data to get more players on board about the importance of this work. We noted that we can learn a lot from other disciplines ranging from medicine to engineering, many of which are having similar internal discussions about how problematic jargon can create barriers for both practitioners and the audiences that they serve. The second is co-production. So this is a concept of creating work in collaboration with the communities that you're serving, rather than making assumptions about their needs and speaking for them, which obviously can cause more harm than good. Learning about best social science practices and as well as communication issues can help researchers avoid common pitfalls like tokenizing colleagues from marginalized groups, navigating intra-community politics, and not getting so caught up in their own disciplinary silos that they miss the opportunity to collaborate with other researchers doing similar work in different fields and learn from their efforts too. We love not reinventing the wheel when we can avoid it. The third is networks for change. And this is really cool. This is a big old brain dump that you can see over here of a lot of the professional societies and a lot of the groups who have been having some of these conversations internally and with one another. As you can see from the photo, we spent a lot of time listing out these major players. Again, started with many of the professional societies that we as invasive species researchers work with, and then branched out to government organizations, databases, activist groups, indigenous nations, funding agencies, journals, and even social media influencers. We determined that professional societies are probably the groups with the most power in species renaming, and engaging with them was going to be very important, but that these other groups are essential for broader scale language use issues. We were reminded that change can occur both from the top down and the bottom up. So keeping track of these conversations between different players and ideally bringing them together sometimes is really important. And then finally, we talked about operationalizing interventions. It is no good to just identify a problem if you aren't going to make an effort to help fix it. So our workshop also focused on meaningful interventions to help make the change that we want to see. Some products that we plan to collect and share include model language guidelines, trainings on message frameworks, reference libraries, and university libguides, and comms training for scientists more specifically. Some strategies that we're going to use to build consensus include getting regional panels, task forces, and professional societies involved directly in this work, and keep these kind of conversations going. So, after all that, how did we do? Well, in terms of numbers, the webinar portion of the workshop was actually a huge success. Thanks very much to NASMA. We had 413 unique logins to the webinar, some of which were confirmed to be lab watch parties with multiple viewers, which was really fun. That actually happened at my alma mater, and that was very sweet. And that is more than NASMA's average attendance at these kinds of events. And it was by far the most popular of the webinars offered for National Invasive Species Awareness Week that year. People tuned in from as far away as Hawaii, Sweden, and even New Zealand. And so that is some serious commitment to navigate those time zones. Shout out to everyone here who's also navigating time zone stuff. Really appreciate you showing up. After the webinar, we sent out an evaluation survey for those who had attended. While we didn't get quite as many responses as we'd hoped, more than 50 people weighed in, and the responses were really interesting and almost entirely positive. So here are some takeaways from that. About half of our respondents hadn't really thought about this issue much at all before, while the other half had thought about it a moderate amount to, well, a very great deal, like some of us. Not all of the information was new to our viewers, but many reported that the information had been presented in a novel and engaging way, and the folks who completed the evaluation were between somewhat and extremely supportive of the work happening in the space. Now, granted, there's probably some selection bias here, because chances are if you show up to a webinar like this, you're interested to begin with, but it was still really nice to get some positive feedback on that. So what's next? Well, in the last, gosh, I guess it's 2 years now since the workshop, we've accomplished quite a bit. We wrote up our findings for the special issue of Management of Biological Invasions, corresponding to iCase 2024. So we turned our initial report into a peer-reviewed open access publication that came out last year. Tim Campbell and I also published a short piece in the Sea Grant special issue of Oceanography called Alien Language that came out last spring that set the groundwork for the concepts that would be explored more in depth in the MBI paper. Our work has also contributed to shaping some of the regional AIS communications guidelines around the Great Lakes Basin, which I believe some of my fellow presenters are going to dive into in a little bit more detail. We are also assisting with both quantitative and qualitative research using a survey on public perceptions of common names for invasive species, led by Kat de Rivera from Portland State, which you will hear from her directly in just a little while, that really builds on some of the name change work discussed at the workshop. Kat and Christine Gilbert will be presenting on the outcomes of this later in the session, so stay tuned. We've made some really great progress on coding and manuscripts, and it's really cool and novel work on actually getting data on public opinion on this subject, so definitely tune in for their talks as well. So, if you are interested in learning more about language use in invasion biology, you're in luck. All of those, I believe, all of the day one webinar recordings are still available through NASMA's YouTube channel for free. And I've also included an introductory reading list on the rhetoric of invasion at the QR code here. Please feel free to get in touch anytime. The Invasive Species Language Workshop was a starting point for work that's going to continue well into the future, and we'd really love to have you on board. Efforts like the Invasive Species Language Workshop are one way to demonstrate collective steps towards more inclusive and effective communication strategies. So by embracing this alternative language and naming conventions, science communicators and scientists themselves can foster broader support and ultimately enhance invasive species management practice. Thank you so much for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Elle. We have some great questions in the chat that we will all collectively be working on answering over the webinar. Some via text, others will hold on to for the discussion, but thank you for the great questions. And we will move on to Kat and Christine to talk about the results from our national language survey. Really, again, trying to get more at kind of what are the impacts of our communications and what is some actual data on how people think about these things. So first up will be Dr. Catherine de Rivera, and Dr. Kat is a professor of environmental science and management at Portland State University, an ecologist with more than 25 years of experience. Her research examines the spread, impacts, and management of introduced marine species, including long-term work on invasive green crabs. She is particularly interested in how biological invasions intersect with climate change, habitat connectivity, and human activities. More recently, her work has expanded to explore how language and naming conventions shape public perception and management of invasive species. Dr. de Rivera integrates applied research, collaborative working groups, and teaching to advance more effective and inclusive approaches to invasive species science and communication. Thank you, Kat.
Hey, thanks, Tim. All right, well, I wanted to start by acknowledging, thanks for all the thumbs up there, acknowledging my co-authors who are 3 undergrads, now alumni, who started this work as in class, and that's Michelle Morginsky, Marissa Hernandez, and Mia Hackett, and 3 Sea Grant invasive species experts and communications experts, and that those include Tim Campbell, who you just heard from, and Elle Lower, who you just heard from, and Sam Chan, and then also a colleague who studies science communication from Stony Brook, Christine Gilbert, who you'll hear from right after this on another aspect of this study. So we are interested in more effective science communication. And in science communication, we often use militaristic metaphors, as Elle was just talking about. And we do this such as saying, like, we need to combat plastic pollution. And we do this because they're engaging and capture attention. But militaristic and nativist language is especially enmeshed in invasions, ecology, and management, just like the word invasions there, as well as the sign, I want you for the war on carp. Are you feeling the call to action? And I'm using invasions as an example throughout, but the issues really apply more broadly in conservation and natural resource management. Okay, so militaristic and nativist framings could backfire, though. For example, it could affect our morale as managers when we're always losing battles. Militaristic language could cause harm when combined with place-based common names as well. We use common names for species because they're more memorable and engaging than scientific ones. In a companion study, about 15% of common names of introduced species include a place in their name, such as Japanese wireweed or Chinese bin crabs. Well, does this matter? Think about the potential benefits from place-based common names. They could spur the instinct to protect and can motivate action. They can attract attention. So those are all positive for managers and science communicators. However, there could be some harms as well. It could backfire with people perhaps identifying with the species instead. It can reinforce xenophobia, suggesting natives good and foreign is bad. It could make people feel unwelcome and even lead to ecological harm. An example of this is with this crab on the right. Beautiful crab we have here in Oregon. It's from the West Coast. And for a while in the 70s and 80s, for marketing purposes, it was called the Japanese crab. And that name has led to public attitudes that the crab is non-native and should be removed. So I've met people who are removing them. And unfortunately, this is a wonderful predator for the actually harmful and actually non-native so-called European green crab. And so removing them is counterproductive to protecting the environment. The combination of militaristic language and place-based names could have the greatest impact, as in eradicate the Asian murder hornet. How does that make you feel? And we don't want negative messaging to be directed towards people, but would it be? Is concern over names and metaphors overly PC and woke? Or would a change help? There's really few studies that document how people actually feel about such communication, either parts of these, and especially not the intersection. And so we wanted to do a study that looked at that, and quantitatively, and you'll soon hear also qualitatively, it helps inform communication and outreach strategies to better achieve our management goals. So we did a study to look at how people react to place-based names. And we specifically were interested in some reactions and how they vary across demographic groups. This is in part because some prior studies have suggested that younger people might be dissuaded from fields based on the language that we use, and we don't want to decrease recruitment into our field. And also, as you can see on the chart to the right, the proportion of, in this case, aquatic nuisance species that have place-based names isn't distributed across places evenly. About 40% of species with place-based names that are invasive or introduced here in the United States, those species come from Asia. And it's in part because we have more species that are introduced from Asia, and in part because there's a disproportionate number of Asian species here that have place-based common names, Europe being the second one. We also wanted to know what information is valued in a species name. And so we distributed an online survey through the survey platform Qualtrics. We had it open for a couple of months, almost 2 years ago now, and got 663 participants who fully filled out the survey. And I just want to take a moment to any of you who took the survey. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the survey participants. It's really useful information. And you can see here that we had a range of ages from 18 and up, and also that kind of peaked around 35 to 49. We had people from different professional statuses, mostly invasive species professionals and other environmental professionals, and then a bunch of people, undergrads, grad students, and university researchers, and then some people who are just interested community members as well. Respondents also were from all over the United States and all sorts of different backgrounds. All right, so what did we find? We first asked about just reactions to militaristic language in the context of invasion. And you can see here that for that question, there's a whole range of responses, with negative responses as well as positive responses to militaristic framings. But that this response really varied with age, with the most positive feelings about militaristic language coming from older respondents, and younger respondents, especially that 18 to 34 year age groups, had mostly negative responses towards militaristic language in the context of invasive species. How will this affect recruitment into the field? We also looked across ethnicities and racial groups and asked the same question about militaristic language. And you can see here that there is a significant difference among groups, but this is mostly driven by people who preferred not to share their ethnicity, who had a strong positive response, whereas other groups had negative responses. This is your average, and if we look at instead the proportion that are positive compared to negative, you can see that still people who prefer not to share kind of drive these differences. But also if we look at Asians, you can see that people who self-identify as Asian mostly felt negatively towards militaristic language in the context of invasive species. It's important to note that for some of the questions, once we worried whether they might bias respondents, how we asked them, we framed differently, and with a random half of the participants getting one framing and the other randomly selected half of the participants getting another framing. And so in this example here, we asked if the combined use of militaristic language and place-based common names for invasive species may foster a negative view of geographic origin of the species. And so you could see that could possibly bias respondents. So we asked half the respondents that, and then the other half, we had that a negative framing instead, asking if the combined use of this language has no impact on the perceptions of geographic region of the species. And to my relief, the framing did not have a statistically significant difference. You can say there's a slight lower number or average response from people who got the framing of it, the negative framing of that it does not affect perception. But really, with all that variance, it's not at all different statistically. And both groups felt, importantly, that these place-based names with militaristic language fosters a negative view of the geographic origin of the species. We also asked this for people from the origin, and same result, that most people felt that there was a negative output from that. And the two framings didn't affect our outcomes. And we had a couple other questions like that as well. Continuing asking about the combination of militaristic language and place-based common names of invasive species, we asked just how that combination of language makes people feel. And we gave them this range of emotions to choose among, shown here. And we've coded for this presentation what we'd want as scientific communicators in taupe, the optimistic, feeling hopeful or curious or enthusiastic, and then feelings that we probably don't want to invoke, we've coded in yellow here, with such as frustrated and sad or excluded or blame. And you can see here that people felt as strongly frustrated as curious. and almost as sad as motivated. Few people felt hopeful or optimistic from this combination of language, and more people felt blame. The lowest response was excluded, but still 1 in 5 people felt excluded from the combination of place-based common names of invasive species and militaristic language. We created one composite variable from all the positive responses shown on the left here, and another composite variable from all the negative responses shown on the right. And so that we could look at how different demographic groups felt in general towards this language. And you can see here that positively, again, people who are a little older, 50 and up, that's my age range, in general felt more positive than younger people. And then if we look instead at the negative emotional scores, you can see that that same group felt less negatively, and that the 18 to 34 felt more negatively in general to that combination of language. Now looking across ethnicities, you can see that similarly, as we might expect from the earlier data, those who prefer not to identify their ethnicity or race felt the most positively overall. And then the other groups didn't really differ that much. And then for negatively, that same group of prefer not to identify felt the least negative. And those who self-identified as at least in part Asian felt the most negatively. And that difference was statistically significant. So looking at this one group, those who identify as Asians, a little more carefully for the specific different feelings, you can see that many respondents who identify as Asian felt at least somewhat excluded, targeted, or threatened from militaristic language used with place-based common names, with about 2/3 of the respondents feeling at least somewhat targeted and 4 out of 5 feeling threatened from the combination of militaristic language and place-based common names. So there's clear negative responses that you might not want from your communication. We also asked what attributes are helpful in a common name. And you can see that while some people felt that naming a species after a person or ethnicity was okay, those were the least common. A bunch of people still felt that naming species after a country or region of origin is useful. We talked about that, the benefits of that earlier. And the most common attribute that people responded positively towards was identifying characteristics, such as mitten crabs have really fuzzy claws. It looks like they're wearing mittens. Also, naming conventions that could be really helpful and were supported by our survey participants is the main impact of the species, how it interacts with its environment, and the behavior of the species. For fun, part of the survey included questions about what would you name some species. And the students in our pilot test, which was given in person, really liked this aspect of the study. However, a good number of our online respondents did not appreciate this part of the survey, and let us know that. But here's an example for this Japanese wireweed. Some students had suggested calling it golden berry seaweed or bubble seaweed, for example, which are kind of fun names. And I wanted to give you a bunch of examples of invasive species names that can enhance public identification and awareness, such as these examples here with dead man's fingers, and upside down jellyfish, signal crayfish, rock snot, lionfish, and spotted lanternfly, all super engaging, kind of fun names that can really help public identification and reporting, as I said. All right, so in conclusion, we asked how people felt about militarized language and place-based common names for invasive species management. And it really depends on the audience, with younger adults and minoritized participants having negative reactions. So would changing framings and naming conventions improve communication effectiveness? Likely, especially for some groups. Other groups pushed back, as you'll hear a little more about from the next talk. We wanted to know how to effectively name introduced species. And as species arrive, please consider using a name that uses identifying characteristics, impacts, or behavior of the species, which can help the public identify and report the species, and was suggested by the participants of the survey. And then there's the question of how we should talk about problematic species. And research has shown that using metaphors, names, and word choices that center restoration of ecological function and culture and health over alienation can be the most effective. And that's certainly in line with what we found in this study. Just want to also note, though, to obtain meaningful outcomes, changing names is important, but it's not the whole story. Our whole processes and systems also would need to change for just outcomes. And I want to thank you all for listening and attending this webinar. I want to thank my co-authors and the many survey participants and the regional panels, et cetera, who helped distribute this, and NIASMA for hosting us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Again, a bunch of really good questions in the Q&A. Elle, Christine, Kat. Be sure to go through them, answer what you want in writing, and be sure to select a few you want to answer live, because there's some fun ones in there. Well, interesting ones that I'm excited to talk about. Okay, so thank you, Kat. We will move to the other part of the survey, the qualitative part and finding of the survey with Dr. Christine Gilbert from Stony Brook University. Christine is an assistant professor at Stony Brook University in New York with joint appointments in the Department of Communication, the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. Her research focuses on utilizing more effective communication strategies to improve outcomes in scientific and environmental contexts. In collaboration with colleagues, she is currently working on a number of projects focused on understanding perceptions of current invasive species naming conventions and communication strategies. This work, and is applying these findings to a local park in New York City struggling with Phragmites. Christine?
Thank you, Tim. Hi, folks. It's wonderful to join you today. I've been answering some questions in the chat. I apologize. I think I did some weird stuff and I accidentally moved some questions around. So if you're looking for an answer to one of your questions and you can't find it, it might be in the answered tab, but I'm happy to elaborate on any of those. So yeah, it's wonderful to be here today. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on some of the qualitative research that was part of the national survey that Kat was talking about. So all of the data that I'm going to be talking about here is part of that same data collection, except we asked participants to respond in their own words instead of just answering questions on a scale from 1 to 5, anything like that. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking kind of through the results of this research. This is not yet published, although we're hoping to have a manuscript out for consideration within the next couple of months. So here are some of the open-ended questions that we wanted to get participants' responses to, right? Part of the reason here to do both quantitative and qualitative work is to get a sense of, kind of on a scale, on an average, where are people generally feeling about a topic? But then we also wanted to give folks the opportunity to write to us about how they were feeling. And for many participants, they took that opportunity very seriously, which is great. So we asked questions like, in one sentence or less, what is the first thought that enters your mind when you hear the term invasive? In your own words, please briefly explain how you believe people react to using militaristic language when communicating about invasive species. If you had an instance where invasive species names or message frames, so things like militaristic framing, made you feel uncomfortable or hindered your ability to do your work with this topic and you would like to share, please go ahead and do so below. And then we kind of had a catch-all, question about please share any comments, concerns, or questions you have about introduced invasive species and their common names, or any comments about the survey in the text box below. And so what we did, so myself, Tim, and Elle, we are doing what's called a content analysis of all of these qualitative responses. So let me talk you through a little bit more. So some folks may not be familiar with this as a methodology. As I mentioned in some of my responses, I am not, I have nothing to do with biology. I'm not an ecologist. My PhD is in communication. And so everything I do is about looking at messages and trying to understand. And so content analysis is a really common methodology to look at big data sets like this, where we have a lot of basically text, and we want to understand what are common themes that people are saying. So we had 645 participant responses, which is fabulous. They ranged in text size. Some folks responded with a couple of words per question, and we have some folks that wrote, much more similar to a small paper, right? Which was really excellent. So what we do is we develop what's called a code book, and I'm actually going to show you an example of what this looks like. And this allows for us to do a systematic review of all of that content, right? The goal being that if I were to give you the 645 participant responses and I gave you the code book, you could identify the same exact variables that we have, right? This is not, in other words, this is not a subjective process. It is meant to be as repeatable and replicable as possible. All right, so here's an example of what a codebook would look like. So for example, the first question we ask participants is, in one sentence or less, what is the first thought that enters your mind when you hear the term invasive, right? We wanted to kind of better understand what are folks' correlations with kind of this term, right? And so what we did is we came up with this code book. So this is a little bit overwhelming. Happy to dive into any of this during Q&A. But we basically found 7 common themes. Folks were oftentimes talking about something in relation to an invasive species being non-native, being introduced, being non-indigenous. Oftentimes folks were talking about the impacts of the invasive species, so it being damaging in some way to the ecosystem, to the economy, to the other plants and animals. People were oftentimes talking about the speed or how aggressive invasive species were. We oftentimes then also had folks that were naming particular invasive species, including one participant who mentioned Audrey 2 from Little Shop of Horrors, which was really funny. We did have a fair number of folks that would describe invasive species from the perspective of being competitive, but wouldn't really talk about if competitive was a negative or a positive, right? So we termed this neutral. We also had participants that talked about control. In other words, they were focused really on what do we do to remediate kind of the invasive species in this area. And then last but certainly not least, we had a lot of folks who talked about how invasive species are unwanted. They don't belong here. They shouldn't be in this ecosystem, right? And so again, if you want to think about kind of the process that Tim and Elle and I are going through, is we're looking at the participants' responses to this question. In one sentence or less, what is the first thought that enters your mind when you hear the term invasive? And then we were saying, okay, which of these are present or absent? And then basically counting how many times did somebody mention the damages? How many times did someone mention the speed? And I'll show you some of the preliminary data that we're seeing. Oh, perfect. Participant 211, perhaps you're on this call, right? So here's an example of what this looks like, right? So we would code this as non-native, right? So they mentioned something about it being non-native or non-indigenous. So we would code this as first thought non-native, and pushing native species out of their areas, right? Something about damages that are happening as a result of that native species. So this is kind of what the codebook process and the coding process looks like. I'm sure that Tim and Elle are shuddering somewhere right now because we've been working on this for a long time. I want to show you one other example, and I think this is kind of where some of, a lot of folks are asking some really interesting questions in the chat, and I think this will kind of, suggest some of what we're seeing in the responses, is we wanted to also understand, right? So we asked people basically, hey, not necessarily what you think about militaristic language, but how do you think other people respond to militaristic language when communicating about invasive species, right? The people you're working with, your colleagues, your grant funders, things like that, right? And so the way that we operationalize this variable is we looked at a range of different things, right? So when we asked people this question, some people would say, I actually think using militaristic framing is counterproductive. In other words, it undermines our environmental goals because it makes people too afraid, it makes them overwhelmed, it makes them go out and buy really harsh chemicals that we don't actually want them to use, right? We also had folks respond neutrally, meaning that they didn't really think there was a relationship between militaristic framing and how people responded. They didn't really think that it mattered very much. We did have many folks, and we'll look at some of the data here, that were motivated. They thought other people would be more motivated to take action because of the militaristic language. In other words, it would help in the progression of reaching those environmental goals. And then most participants were what we called nuanced. So they had kind of this understanding that, well, I think some people might really like the militaristic language and it might be really effective. And I think other people might hear it and might shut down, right? So in other words, the answer is kind of, it depends, right? It might work for some people and it might not work for all. And then we had folks who, would sometimes put an incorrect answer in that text box, and so we wouldn't code that. Or some participants didn't respond, right? We didn't force responses for any of these questions. It was really meant to be if folks had time and the energy to contribute to the research, and we are very grateful for that. So here's an example of what one of these would look like. So in your own words, please briefly explain how you believe people react to using militaristic language when communicating about invasive species. And this participant thought fearful and like the target needs destroying. In other words, they thought the militaristic language is helpful, that it motivates people to actually take action. So it is productive, right? So that's how we would code that. All right, let me tell you current status before I walk you through some of the results, and then we will open it up for questions, and I suspect we will have a lot of them, which is fabulous. So we have finished, Tim, Elle, and I have finished what's called intercoder reliability, which is where we develop this code book, and we basically test it and test it and test it to make sure that we are applying the code book consistently to the data, so that if anyone were to take the code book and anyone were to take the participant responses, they would identify the same themes that we're finding, right? So we have check intercoder reliability. It's something that we will look for. Basically, researchers in the communication discipline look for this as a measure of the strength of the analysis, if you will, the making sure that the results are reliable and are valid, right? So we are now coding the remaining 600 responses. So as you can imagine, that takes some time. But what I'm going to show you today is basically the 65 participants that we used to test for intercoder reliability. We randomly selected these from the larger population of 645. And so I have pretty good confidence that the results I'm going to show you today will be quite consistent with our overall population. But I should always mention as a caveat, these are not the final results, right? You're going to have to wait for the manuscript to be published, hopefully coming, later this year. Okay, so I'm going to focus on 3 research questions just because, for time commitment's sake. Number 1, I'm going to show you the results for what are the first thoughts that people have when thinking about the term invasive. Research question 2, how do people believe others react to the use of militaristic language when communicating about invasive species? And then research question 5, what proportion of participants defended the current naming conventions used in invasive species communication? Now, you'll notice research question 5 is not a direct question that we asked participants. Instead, this is a variable that Tim, Elle, and I were looking for, where folks would oftentimes say kind of in the comments, I understand why some people might want to change some of the language, but I think it's really helpful when we have geographic place included to identify whether or not something is invasive or is native, right? So I'm going to show you, because I think this is, where some really interesting tensions are obviously happening, and we're seeing that in some of the questions that folks are asking. Okay, so here's what we're seeing for some preliminary results, capital P here, is what are the first thoughts that people have when thinking about the term invasive? Perhaps unsurprisingly for many of you in your work, most folks, about 71% of the 65 participants that we're looking at for this example, mentioned something about the damages. In other words, the negative impacts that come from invasive species being present. The second most common one, about 51% of folks mentioned something about where the plant was from, right? It being native, non-native, introduced, invasive, right? Any kind of term that would be used. And then we had, about 5% of people were naming particular species, and then about, 10% here kind of for these other speed, neutral, control, and unwanted. But overwhelmingly, folks were thinking about the impacts, and we're also thinking about kind of the origin of those particular species. So, perhaps no surprises here, but certainly interesting to see empirically. Question number 2. How do people believe others react to the use of militaristic language when communicating about invasive species? I mentioned this kind of briefly, so I maybe spoiled the surprise a little bit. Most folks, although it's only 31%, so it's certainly not a majority, think that other people are nuanced in how they respond to militaristic language. In other words, a lot of people thought that some people might really think that the militaristic language is really helpful for making progress towards those environmental goals. And other people could also basically see, the opposite side where maybe it doesn't work super well. Counterproductive and motivated to take action, we're pretty close. In other words, it seems pretty split. People seem, they're within kind of the population that we sampled here, right? People are pretty mixed about, is militaristic language effective, right? And people kind of there's not an overwhelming consensus, right? Some people think it does, some people think it doesn't, and then others think maybe it's somewhere kind of in the middle, right? Which is really interesting. And then last but not least, what proportion of participants defended the current naming conventions used in invasive species communication? Most of the time when we saw folks mentioning things about why we might want to continue using some of the naming conventions, right? Not all of them. They were oftentimes saying something along the lines of, the reason that we use a place-based name has nothing to do with any additional racist or xenophobic connotations, right? It's simply to indicate to people that this plant or this animal is coming from another area, right? So we called this the just a place identifier, meaning that folks were saying, just because we use a country's name doesn't mean that people automatically are going to have a negative reaction, right? For example, that's kind of what folks were saying. And we also had folks that were worried about confusion, right? So if we change names, is there going to be confusion? And then there's also folks that were basically saying, hey, there's a lot of other concerns that we have within this field of invasion biology. We need to be focused on that instead of kind of naming convention. So there's certainly, right, there are certainly folks that this is not a monolith by any stretch of the imagination, right? There's a lot of kind of mixed feelings when it comes to, naming conventions, which is great from a research perspective because it means there's more to do, but it can be challenging from a practitioner perspective. All right, so let me talk you through some of the initial takeaways to summarize, and then I'm going to stop, and I think we're just going to have about half an hour now for Q&A, which is fabulous. So again, right, non-native, native seems to be a really important initial first thought for people, although most folks are thinking primarily about the negative impacts. There's mixed opinions, right? People are, at least from the qualitative data perspective. And again, right, one of the questions somebody asked was about kind of response bias, which is when people feel really strongly about something, they are more likely to engage in the survey. And that is absolutely something we have to keep in mind. But when people were talking in the qualitative responses about place-based names and militaristic language, people were pretty mixed about whether it works, whether it doesn't work, unintended consequences, things like that. And oftentimes those who are defending the use of place-based names are kind of pushing back against this idea that names may have other interpretations, right? Which is, it's not something certainly that we're here to rebuke, but more so just to say that some people kind of are maybe somewhat skeptical of kind of this interpretation. Now, I should say too, qualitative research is limited in terms of its what we can do with statistical analysis. But the beauty is that we have direct quotes. So we actually have kind of people's language and words when they're talking about this, right? So I'll leave you with this. So participant 205 said, in support of this kind of movement, I look forward to continued progress on this effort and more broad efforts to reconsider the use of invasive species common names with geographic reference. And we also had folks who were in opposition, like participant 420. A denotation of a place of origin can be a helpful indicator that the species is not native to a certain area, right? So it is a really rich data set that we're looking at, and I'm really looking forward to kind of finalizing the results and, sharing best practices, but there is a lot in the field to consider. I'm going to go ahead and this is my contact information. I'm at Stony Brook University here in New York. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think Tim hand it back to the broader group. Thanks for listening, folks.
Thanks, Christine. And again, thank you everyone for all of the questions. There's still 26 on here that we haven't answered, so I have a feeling we're gonna have trouble getting to all of them. And I should have been doing a much better job of trying to condense them to help facilitate a discussion. But I think one question that is, I think, present in a couple of different questions is just this idea of thinking about people that are maybe resistant to our communications, I guess people that are laggards on the social innovation curve that just seem to not currently be responding to our existent invasive species prevention messaging, and what are things that we might be able to do to kind of get them on board with invasive species prevention. Or is it worth talking to them at all?
Well, one thing is just we can change the language we use and reach out to reporters. And, when we're reporting species, bring it up, like, let's not call it wherever it's from for this reason. And just like changing our own language doesn't hurt anybody. So, and then eventually people are going to be hearing that more and more. So that's a pretty subtle and long-term approach, but it's a start.
Something I would think a little bit more about too is that um, we often try to think of communications in terms of what works for us. Like, I feel like write about your past experiences, like you know yourself the best, right? And so we're thinking about communications that speak to other environmental managers and people working in this space, and those are what we're most familiar with. We are less familiar with uh, the people that aren't already on board with our message. So I spend a lot of time just trying to think about like who are those people that aren't on board already, and how does my message need to be different to reach them? And oftentimes it's not something that I'm going to think of. I need to be engaged with these communities using survey data, doing message testing to try to make sure that these messages are actually reaching these folks and having some sort of impact on them. So uh, yeah, it's usually something that takes a lot more work than just me thinking it up.
Yeah, this goes back to that concept of co-production again that we touched on at the Invasive Species Language Workshop. It has to be a process done in collaboration with the affected communities, because otherwise you've only got your own perspective and you're making a lot of assumptions about how other people feel. That is like the utility of this work. Even seeing that people got mad at us for doing this work, and trust me, some of the responses we got to the survey were, let's say, less than polite. We have been called a whole number of names for even doing this work and being told that this was a waste of time. But how on earth are you supposed to map the territory if you don't actually talk to people who might be disagreeing with you as well and seeing what the shape of public opinion actually looks like? So this is why we got to talk to people and do more quantitative and qualitative social science research. Bit.
And the only thing that I will add from kind of a communication perspective, is there's a lot of similarities in from what I'm seeing. A lot of my prior research has been about climate change communication, and so this idea of people who are intransigent, kind of to that message, who are not willing to listen. Right, there's a lot of empirical evidence that really one of the only ways to get through to people who are resistant to a certain type of message is to build long-lasting relationships over time, which is not easy. It's not cheap, and it doesn't fix the problem immediately. But when we can establish kind of these relationships and rapport with people, we know that over time you tend to become a more trusted member of their in-group because it's someone that you're seeing on a regular basis, you're interacting with in some way. And so that's certainly right from a communication perspective. I suppose I don't know that it's comforting to know that these types of groups that are really hard to get in touch with and talk to, this is common in other fields as well, not just invasive species communication.
So another question that looks like it might have some good kind of broad applicability for people um, is from MK Jensen. We use weed warriors and crayfish corps for our two popular volunteer initiatives for invasive species management. Those are both military terms, but our park, Valley Forge National Historical Park, has direct ties to the military and military history. So it seems to fit in that regard, but I agree in general that militarized terms are used too much. Thoughts? Um, yeah, I think this is something that comes up quite often that it's really easy to brand programs using this militaristic language, like weed warriors. So um, maybe what are some ideas in terms of rebranding it, or when might it be acceptable to use this language for invasive species kind of management and prevention programs? Yeah. Something that I would probably start with is that, at least in this context, I appreciate that it seems like you have thought this out really well in terms of that these volunteer programs are present at a park that has very close military ties, the Valley Forge National Historical Park. Um, so this decision would probably be harder for those organizations than others. But I'm probably never going to say never use militaristic language because as a scientist, I never 100% say never do anything. But I'd be very kind of aware of what potential backfire effects there could be, and that if there might just be something that is better for accomplishing your goals, that with invasive species, it's very hard to actually win, and wars have winners and losers. So if you can't actually win, you're setting yourself up for failure. So there might be different metaphors that kind of help keep people engaged with the invasive species management, or trying to make the park a better place, which is what I imagine that these groups are going to do and what other similar groups are doing.
These are just really hard questions. Is I think part of the reason why we're all like just thinking and not answering. That was a great answer though, Tim. And then, I mean, another piece is just reaching out and seeing how open people are to change. It's certainly easier to start names with rather in a new way rather than changing past names, because there can be substantial pushback that doesn't achieve anything, but it's always worth exploring and saying like, because of these reasons, would you consider changing? And then brainstorming what people would be excited about for a name.
Yeah, a lot of it is, I think, knowing how to pick your battles, to use another military metaphor here. I think a lot of people have expressed concern about, even the term invasive itself being of military origin, and trying to excise all military metaphors from the English language when communicating about ecological issues. May be easier said than done. And I think avoiding mission creep and like trying to focus on scope of what is actively some of the more pressing things that we could do harm mitigation on, rather than trying to over police our language to the point that we can't communicate effectively with one another, is like, that's a very difficult line to walk. And that is one of the reasons that these social science based scoping exercises, to get a sense of public opinion and get a sense of practitioners' opinion as well, is so important here, so we don't overshoot and wind up undercutting ourselves and our efforts.
I feel like another question along these lines that have popped up a couple of times is just what are some good alternatives to militaristic language? I think a couple of questions on, the term it's invasive itself can be problematic. So if we should try to, avoid using some of these militaristic and loaded terms, what are some good alternatives that we can use to communicate effectively, or what's the path to getting this information so we can all have better tools to communicate better?
There's a good and a bad answer. The good answer is that some of the folks on this call, and then I'm recognizing some names that I'm seeing in the chat, are this very much is cutting edge research. The bad news is that there's not a lot of empirical evidence out there. There haven't been a lot of experiments to test new language. Much of the research, certainly that we've been engaging in, that I'm familiar with in this area, has been, are people, is this even something people want to address? Is this something that people feel like is important and matters and we should be spending time and resources? And the answer seems to be yes, to some extent, to some degree, as Elle pointed out, that we don't want over policing of language to kind of be the goal here, right? It's about trying to make sure that our communication is reflective of the good work that everybody's trying to do. And so there's a lot of good work that's happening in workshops like Elle talked about. I know that there have been other sessions similar to that where it's kind of testing out and seeing what works, but empirically there's not a ton in the existing literature. And so that's kind of, moving forward, that will be a really exciting area of research to try and figure out, especially for different types of audiences, right? So if we're trying to study a group who traditionally has been very resistant to these types of messages, might it be that a new framing technique might actually be particularly effective for them? But there isn't a ton we can necessarily say right now from an experimental or causal perspective is kind of what I would say. But it's an exciting future, which is a very unsatisfying answer for today.
Certainly, my students have been responding well to introduced species and problematic species over invasive species. So those are possibilities.
And then on the tool front, I know with the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, we have some work planned on trying to develop communication tools and guides for people. Elle and I have worked on creating some of these tools and are trying to work on getting them to the finish line so that people can use them to, communicate more accurately and more effectively. And so I just, supporting these tools and using them when they eventually come out, I think will go a long ways in making sure we can do more of this kind of work. So you all don't have to think too hard about how to do this. You can have some good guidelines on how to do it, because I know the less I have to think about things, the more likely I am to do it. So I know there's like at least one or two other questions I wanted to answer live that I can't find now, because you guys have so many questions. We should always have this many questions. Um, but I don't know, Al, Kat, Christine, was there anything that you all wanted to bring up? And we had some specific questions about correlations within the survey, and I think like some method specific stuff that might be best answered in the chat, or we can follow up on. I think there was a question about kind of our survey sample, and it was, I think, best described as a sample of convenience, but included aquatic nuisance species task force members, regional aquatic nuisance species panel members. So that's a group of state, federal, NGO, aquatic invasive species professionals. It was also sent out to students, primarily in Oregon, but as well as Wisconsin, Michigan. We tried to get a really broad group of students wherever kind of our connections were. But I think you'll see, if you were to really break down the demographics of the survey, outside of the ANS task force and the regional panels, it's really kind of correlated to where we are all based, because that's where our social networks are. So I don't think that, at least when we're writing up this research, I don't think we are claiming this to be the end all be all for this topic. But considering that we did it, I think, without any extra funding, that it's a good place to start with some preliminary data for somebody to maybe do this with a more robust sample, or more specifically pick out certain demographic groups like boaters and anglers that might think differently about some of our messaging.
Yeah, and to follow on that, it would be like we really mostly focused on managers and students. And I think we sampled those pretty well. Again, thank you all for participating, for those of you who did. And but we really don't have a robust sample of the general public, and that would also be really helpful. So I feel like there's a great need for a follow-on survey.
Yeah, a lot of this just seems to be doing preliminary groundwork to get some of these questions answered. There's a lot that we can't definitively answer right now just because all we have are anecdotes, whether that is a weird conversation you had at an outreach event, which was literally what sparked this as an interesting research topic to me, or a conversation that you have with your colleagues at a conference over drinks about how interestingly someone's slide was framed in a particular discussion. So what we're trying to do is actually get some of this data down in the first place to be sure that we have a record of it. And it's not just anecdotal evidence that we're drawing from, we're actually getting testimony from people. So all of you showing up here, and actually even the contents of the webinar chat, are like super interesting and cool to see written down. So yeah, we will need a lot more research on this, and I hope this can continue to actually get some of those answers out there.
And I think big picture, I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think most people drawn into environmental work, and especially invasive species work, are not communication specialists. We are biologists, environmental scientists trying to think about environmental management, and we don't have the communication training or the social science training to think about what kind of research needs to be done or can be done, and even what kind of questions we can answer. So that's why I really value kind of partnerships and collaborations like our work with Christine and other social scientists around the country that actually know how to answer these questions. And this is something that comes up in the language workshop recommendations, just intentionally bringing in these researchers and scholars to help us figure out how to do this. Because I can't biology my way out of a language question. Like, I need communication science. And we need the experts to help us with that. So I think the more we can engage colleagues that think more about communication and social science, the better off we will be in addressing these questions.
Tim, there's a question that just kind of popped up that I thought was interesting. Oh my God, there are so many questions. Hold on, I lost it. Aha, found it. Okay. That I kind of want to answer from a communication perspective, and maybe this will help. I'm not sure that it'll help alleviate anything, but maybe it would. So Dylan asked a question in the chat, kind of talking about, thank you for the research, but in practice, I'm seeing these recommendations for inclusive language being implemented in a way that creates a culture of censorship in the workplace, especially by public land managers. And so just kind of saying, how do we avoid kind of creating an environment where we're just kind of policing each other's language and it doesn't actually seem like we're, making progress from an environmental or ecological perspective. And again, from a purely communication perspective, which is really my only lens, I have no biological or ecological training, right? I'm very much an outsider in that way. I think it is that what I want to say is that from a communication perspective, there is no such thing as the perfect message, right? And that's kind of the terrible irony of the research that I do, which is regardless of how many times I test a message and test a message and test a message, it is not going to work for 100% of people, right? Because we're all different, right? I can be convinced that Tom Hanks is the best actor of all time, and somebody's going to have an opinion and a problem with that, right? And that's okay. And so what I would encourage you all to think of from a communication perspective as we're kind of working on this work and as you're kind of maybe butting up against some of these changes and recommendations is that it's not about being perfect. It's about communicating our values in different things through the language that we use. And so if we think maybe from a standpoint that we shouldn't be using place-based names anymore because it tends to create negative associations with people from that place, right? If that's what we see in the research, then right, it's not about saying you're a bad person because you use this certain language. It's about saying, okay, so maybe our best practices need to change. And not everybody has the privilege to have access to that information right away, right? I have an incredible privilege here at a university. I know Kat does, Elle, Tim, right? Any of us who are lucky enough to work through a university have the opportunity to have access to this information. And so again, there's just no such thing as perfect framing. And so Dylan's question is really well said. And I would just encourage all of us to think about, right? Improving our communication is like anything, right? You get better over time, and it's not about being right or wrong. It's about trying to move forward with the best communication practices that we can based on what the research is saying. And I'm not sure if that's helpful or if that's useful, but that's kind of, I understand what Dylan is saying, and that's kind of how I would, I would suggest we think about it rather than telling other people they're wrong, saying, hey, this is another way that we might want to move forward based on this research, right? Similar to how you would do anything within kind of management practices.
Precisely. And not to mention that tailoring message frameworks to different groups is also a really good option. Just as the perfect is the enemy of the good, there is no one size fits all model that is going to like directly and perfectly beam pure information into somebody else's brain. So figuring out the players and the demographics and the viewpoints that we're working with will allow us to have a plurality of messaging to get as many people as possible on board, because that is the best way to address the issue of invasive species, is to get as many people as possible on board. We need all hands on deck for this issue. And I do like the comments in the chat. Thank you, Doug, about the values-based stuff as well.
So I think a good question to maybe think about kind of moving forward is from Robin at Biodiversity Works. Are there any resource groups where people maneuvering appropriate invasion ecology communication can meet and discuss strategies for change, maybe via Zoom or some other online chatting forum, maybe the NASMA forums? Yeah, because it would definitely be useful to have others to lean on and learn from. So I think this is a question, for everyone in attendance just as much as it is for us in terms of how can we continue this conversation moving forward? Where can we talk about these things? Tegan, Naisma, how can we work together to continue to talk about these things? Are more webinars like this useful? More informal things? Open to feedback, everyone.
Yeah, we're definitely open to supporting continuing this conversation in any way that we can. Moving forward, there's just been some incredible interest. So yeah, NASMA is happy to support this work moving forward and open to ideas and suggestions. Absolutely.
And I see Katie's comment on there was a NASMA committee that was going to think about this previously, and know that we had to refocus some priorities. So maybe sometime in the near future, it could be a good idea to, or I'd be happy to be a part of that committee and maybe think about how we can frame this work moving forward so that way we could think more about effective communications, and so we can do this work no matter the timeline we're in. Christine Alcat, I know there's still a bunch of open questions that I would love to try to continue to answer. I'm having trouble picking out which ones to answer. But I do think outside of anything I might have missed that might be good for kind of broader communication or discussion, I'd be happy to just try to answer most of these kind of in a follow-up document like I know we've done in the past. Again, unless if I missed something that looks like would be good for more conversation.
Tim, Elle, and others, good to see you. Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. I did want to suggest that after we're done today, we could potentially reach out to those in attendance and those in our membership to continue the conversation, if that would be of interest. I know Tegan had mentioned we have discussion boards available. Please go in to the NASMA portal and check that out as a way to continue those conversations. But I think that this was a great start and looking forward to continuing to talk about this topic. And it looks like even as we chat, folks are saying, yes, absolutely. So you'll be hearing from Tegan. Please check your email. And thanks again to all of our presenters. Tegan, I know you have a few slides to wrap us up. If you'd like to go ahead.
Absolutely. And again, I just want to, thank all of our speakers today and everyone for joining us. Just fantastic conversations going on. I think we were all struggling to keep up with all the questions and the chat. So I wanted to thank you for that. Just a few more events before we close out. So we have a great lineup of free monthly webinars for 2026. Next month, we'll have Mara Rice, our NASMA Government Relations Manager, giving a presentation on shaping public policy, advocacy in action, and that will lead into National Invasive Species Awareness Week. So we hope to see you there. And then in March, we'll be joined by Dr. Carla D'Antonio and Dr. Robert Fitch of the University of California, Santa Barbara to discuss invasive grasses and wildfire risk in California. You can register for these at nasma.org/events, and we'll be adding additional webinars there soon, so keep a lookout. And then lastly, I'd like you all to save the date for the 2026 NASMA Annual Conference. Join over 300 attendees in Alexandria, Virginia from October 19th through the 22nd. Our theme this year is Local Leadership, Global Impact. And we have some great keynote speakers lined up already, and registration is now open. This might be another opportunity to continue this conversation. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at an upcoming event soon. In case you missed any part of this webinar, the recording will be posted to the NASMA YouTube channel sometime next week. Thank you, everyone, and thank you again to our speakers.